Well, I think it's a bit exaggerated to say that the relationship is one that is closer than brothers. The Philippines and Japan have had a long history of close relations, but it has not always been friendly. There were times, of course, before the Spaniards came, the Philippines was already trading with Japan, and those were fairly friendly. They were not the closest of relations because we were not yet a whole nation at the time, and then we were trading with China and other Southeast Asian countries. And then, of course, Japan shut its doors to the outside world for over 200 years. And then when Japan reopened its doors, the Philippines was moving into a state of nationalism. Japan had not yet modernized in the 1860s, 1870s. So for both countries, these were formative years. Japan was entering the Meiji Restoration. The Philippines was moving into trying to form its own statehood through the revolution. So we'll move into the early 20th century and you'll see a fairly friendly relationship. But again, since the first part of the 20th century is dominated by American colonial rule, it was not that close a relationship. We were much closer with the US. Trade-wise, of course, the trade was dominated by trade with the US. But Japan had risen by the 1920s to become the second largest trading partner of the Philippines. So from the 1920s, 1930s, Japan was becoming a significant player in Philippine trade. Politics, no, because it was really still an American show. But of course, World War II came, and that changed our perspective of Japan. So Japan became an enemy. Japan took over the country, and while there were some Japanese who were sympathetic to the Philippines, it was still a war, and therefore it was really a military strategy that dictated Japanese policy towards the Philippines. Japan, of course, lost the war, and after the war, it took time to rebuild that friendly relationship. In fact, after the war, the sentiment here was very anti-Japanese, and if you were in fact considered to have Japanese blood, you would be ostracized by the people. Some of the Nikkei Jin, the descendants of the Japanese who stayed here, had to change their names just to hide their identity, their ancestry. After the war, all Japanese were forbidden from the Philippines. They all had to go back home. So the only ones left here were the Nikkei Jin, or the children, or those with Japanese ancestry, but with Philippine citizenship. Were expelled. Yes, they were all returned. And this was at the time that the Philippines became independent. So all the Japanese were really returned to Japan. Even those who had stayed here for 20, 30 years, the soldiers who arrived 1 year before the war ended, everybody, it was a blanket order, all the Japanese had to leave the Philippines. As a young republic, the Philippines wanted to exact revenge, or at least justice, on certain Japanese who were identified as being instigators or those who conducted the massacres. So we conducted our own war crimes until 1949, and we actually imprisoned Japanese war criminals. We executed a few because they were really convicted, found guilty of war crimes and atrocities. But as that was going on, we were trying to reconcile with Japan, and the peace treaty with Japan was signed in 1951, but this was the San Francisco Treaty, but we did not want to ratify it yet because the Americans were trying to force us to give up reparations payments from Japan, and we felt it our obligation to seek those reparations. That was a form of justice. Aside from justice to the war criminals, then there had to be justice in terms of financial compensation. We were charging the Japanese with $8 billion, including all the lives lost at the time. And Japan said they could not pay that amount of money. They could pay only a fraction of that. And there was strong pressure from the United States to accept the Japanese offer because this was the height of the Cold War. In fact, the Korean War had broken out. Hostilities in Vietnam were starting at this time. Two countries met in between, in which the reparations agreement was finally signed in 1956. and that is when we ratified the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So 1956 is the commencement of the regular relations between the Philippine Republic, that was independent, and Japan now as a newly recognized member of the United Nations. So from 1956 onwards, the 50 years after that was building up the relations between the two countries. And again, there were high points, there were low points, so it was not a totally bloodless thing. So this only began to ease up in the 1960s. So 1962, the Crown Prince Akihito, who is now emperor, visited the Philippines with his wife, and that marked a change in attitudes, I think, because the Crown Prince was very young. He was a symbol of emergent Japan, a peaceful Japan. This was the post-war Japan. And then immediately after that, in 1964, you have the Olympics being held in Tokyo, and we participated in the Olympics. And after that, you have Japanese imports beginning to come in, among them Japanese cars, and you would have the first Toyota cars coming in, heavy equipment, bulldozers. So the Japanese presence was becoming more and more visible. And at this time also, Japan, insofar as the Philippines was concerned, was not that expensive a place to visit. So the yen was manageable compared to the peso, and Filipinos were able to go to Japan as tourists. So they were going to Hong Kong, they were going to Japan also. So the relationship began to deepen from that point on. And then when martial law was declared, of course, what Marcos did was to open up the Philippines to Japanese investments. And partly because of the reparations deal also, you would have a lot of Japanese money coming into the Philippines. However, this was not completely free of bias. There were a lot of irregularities that took place. There was corruption at the highest level. There's a lot of money from the reparations agreement that we have not been able to fully account for, and there were shady deals that took place. And especially by the late 60s, when the student movement began to develop here and in other countries, the sentiment was also that Japan was coming in as an economic animal, that Japan was sending its investments, its cars, its products without a soul. So the sentiment by the early 70s was this second invasion of the Philippines. So that's why I would say the Fukuda doctrine that develops as a result of that in the 1970s was a heart-to-heart relationship. Let's improve it from just being a simple economic relationship, and let's make it more of a person-to-person relationship. So with that attitude, you'd have exchange students, you'd have cultural exchanges, you'd have the Japanese from Japan Foundation and all of this. So it would branch out into deeper relations rather than just simple economic relations. It moved into other aspects, other avenues, and that helped develop it even further. Of course, there were also other irritants. The corruption cases continued on, and there was this issue of Japanese sex tours coming to the Philippines. You have Japanese men coming here to take advantage of Filipino women, and the women's groups here protested about that. And so that they kind of toned down the sex tours, but instead Filipinas wound up going to Japan. So you have the phenomenon of Japayuki-san coming out of that. So that would also taint the Philippine-Japan relationship. It was not exactly that rosy. So I mean, the government wants to say it's a very close relationship, but it is a close relationship. We depend on each other very strongly, but again, there are a lot of kinks in the road. And so when we re-examine all of this relationship, it's good to look at the high points, but also see that both countries will have to benefit from it. It can't be one country benefiting from it. It has to be a real bilateral relationship. The two countries will share from the closeness of the relationship. In the case of China, it's quite a different situation there. In fact, the issues of the war have been raised on in the last 20 years or so. Now, of course, China's background was different from ours because China turned communist, and for a long time they had to try to solidify under that communist regime, and only in the 1970s did they open up. It was in the 1970s that the US recognized them, we recognized China also, and so that was when the Cold War began to thaw. Prior to that, it was really communist versus free world. Japan was on the free world side, US, and so there was very little connection being made. When China slowly began to open in the 70s, and particularly the 80s, they wanted a friendly relationship with the rest of the world. So they were linking out to Japan to try to build up their friendship. Now, as China built up and became stronger, and Japan was also at the peak of its economic power at this time, then China would see that there was an unfair treatment that they were getting. And as that unfair treatment was perceived more strongly, then they began to realize that, we have to concentrate on what happened here. So one of the biggest cases, of course, is the rape of Nanjing, the Nanjing massacre, in which 100,000 civilians were killed. That has been a very problematic issue because conservative elements in Japan have always contested that number. It's not 100,000, it's maybe 10,000 or 30,000, but 100,000. So they've been arguing over that number for the last 20, 30 years. And China has been using war memory as a kind of political tool. So on the other hand, also, Japan has been slowly, in a sense, militarizing. One thing about Japan after the war was that they had that very unique provision in their constitution, Article 9, which stated that Japan would never have armed forces. Japan renounced war as an instrument of national policy and all of that. And while we have that article there had been moves recently to try to repeal that or to modify it, to amend it. And that if that clause is amended, Japan would become a normal nation and therefore would have a regular armed force. But if Japan would have regular armed forces, what they have today, their self-defense forces, are already stronger than, let's say, the Philippine armed forces. And they say it's not an armed force, it's just a self-defense force. So if they do put up an armed force, it's going to make them a potential threat to the area. And that's one thing I think China doesn't want to see. Korea's case is a little different because Korea had a longer experience under Japan than China did. Of course, China had a longer experience than we did. The Sino-Japanese War started in 1937, but even before 1937, the Japanese took over Manchuria in 1931. Korea was taken over by the Japanese in 1910. So the Koreans were under Japan directly since 1910. That's 35 years under Japanese rule. So they felt that very strongly. The Koreans were forbidden to speak their language. They had to change their names to Japanese names. It was a very harsh rule. They were not able to bring out their history until fairly recently. But again, the Korean government was a dictatorship for a long time. It was military rule. And so there was no freedom of expression. And so that comes out only much later when there is more room to talk about this. And that's why Korea and China, China has been using it as a political tool. South Korea, in a sense, a political tool, but also to address the injustices that the Koreans had faced for all those long years. In the Philippine case, some people have said the Filipinos have very short memories. So we don't remember the past. We don't study the past. We don't give importance to our past. And we are too accommodating of foreigners. So it's said that in our dealings with Japan, we are more accommodating to them than we are to ourselves. So when we look at World War II, the initial years after World War II, we did focus on our heroes. We really emphasized their role in the war, the guerrillas. But I think we became too bored of that. It was too generic. And then with martial law, of course, military rule, and then you have the questionable medals and war record of Marcos that tarnished the image of many veterans. He said, if the president is capable of lying about his war exploits, what about everybody else? So it's only in the 1990s that interest in the war began to come up again. But it never was able to get enough steam to be able to mobilize the sense of the scale of reaction as in China and South Korea. So again, why? Because we were too dependent on Japan economically. We were receiving a lot of assistance, economic aid, and all of this. And Filipinos were going to Japan, marrying Japanese, and there were Filipinos working in Japan. So the thing was, why focus on this past, bloody past, which was a very short period, and now the Japanese are so good to us. So the thing about this is, again, we're too patronizing of them, and we've forgotten our own heroes, which was ironic because there's many are still alive, and we don't even know what they did. So it's a case of colonial mentality in a sense that we have become more patronizing to them. So just to give a case in point, I think a few years ago, there was an attempt by one group of war survivors to ask the government to declare September 3 as a special holiday. Not a non-working holiday, but just a special day to remember the end of the war, the end of World War II. Who were those who protested? Within the government itself, Department of Tourism, Department of Trade. It was these internal, they felt that we will hurt the Japanese. And you look at, let's say, Singapore, and Singapore has put up war memorials. This is where the Japanese executed thousands of Chinese. This is where the Kempei Tai station was in downtown Singapore. And every year they commemorate February 15 when Singapore fell. They are proud of it. He said, this is something we should never remember, we should never repeat. And the Japanese have been complaining it, but this is part of our history. So it's here we're giving up our history simply because we think that we're going to scare the Japanese. They're not going to be scared. I don't think. In fact, there is a young generation of Japanese who are becoming more interested in what happened here, and they want to bring to the Japanese public what really happened in the Philippines.